Hello and welcome to the Whispering Worlds channel. What would you do if the life you built began to crumble, one secret at a time? In this gripping tale, Ethan and Sarah's picture-perfect marriage is torn apart by hidden desires and devastating choices, forcing them to confront their deepest fears and regrets. Through Ethan's raw determination to rebuild and Sarah's struggle for redemption, this story will challenge your perceptions of trust, forgiveness, and what it means to truly move on. What decisions would you make in their place? Could you find hope in heartbreak? Our marriage was the kind people admired from the outside. 10 years strong, 2 wonderful kids, and a house that echoed with laughter. But beneath the surface, the weight of our busy lives had begun to press against us, subtle and insidious. It was a Saturday morning, and I was watching our kids, Lily and Jack, bicker over the remote. Jack, 9, had his heart set on cartoons, while 6-year-old Lily was arguing passionately for a sing-along. Sarah, my wife, sat in the kitchen, engrossed in her phone, sipping coffee with an absent-minded smile. The faint hum of her scrolling filled the room, blending into the noise of the television and the kids' chatter. "Jack, give your sister a turn," I called out, trying to referee without leaving my chair. I glanced toward Sarah. "Need anything from the store? I was thinking of heading out." "Oh no, I'm fine," she replied without looking up. Her tone was polite but distant, and I felt a pang of unease. It wasn't the first time lately that her warmth seemed muted. I lingered a moment longer, watching her. She seemed engrossed in something on her phone, occasionally smiling or typing with quick, sure fingers. I wanted to ask what she was working on but decided against it. Maybe she was caught up in her blog. Her photography work had been gaining traction, and I knew how much it meant to her. Still, the thought nagged at me as I grabbed my jacket and keys. Later that evening, the house settled into its usual rhythm. The kids were asleep, their faces peaceful in the glow of their nightlights. I sat in the living room, nursing a beer and flipping through channels without much interest. Sarah was in her study, the door shut. She'd taken to spending most evenings there, editing photos or responding to her growing audience. I told myself it was normal, that she was busy pursuing her passion. But the distance between us felt tangible, like a wall I couldn't see but kept running into. "Hey, you coming to bed soon?" I called out as I passed the study on my way to our room. "In a bit," she replied, her voice muffled through the door. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, then thought better of it. If she needed space, I wanted to respect that. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through my fingers, something I couldn't name. The days blurred together in the usual chaos of work and parenting. My construction firm was busier than ever, leaving me exhausted most nights. Sarah's blog continued to thrive, and with it came an influx of messages and comments from followers. I was proud of her. She'd worked so hard to build her platform. But with each passing week, her phone seemed more like an extension of her hand, and our conversations grew shorter. One night, as we sat on the couch after dinner, I tried to bridge the gap. "So, how's the blog going? You've been working so hard on it lately." She looked up, startled, as if I'd interrupted something important. "Oh, it's good. Really good. People seem to like my posts." "That's great," I said, trying to sound enthusiastic. "Maybe we could celebrate sometime, just the two of us? It's been a while since we had a date night." Her smile flickered. "Yeah, maybe. Things are just so busy right now. You know? The kids, the blog." I nodded, letting it drop, but the hollow feeling in my chest lingered. The first real warning sign came weeks later. It was subtle, almost innocuous. Sarah had left her laptop open on the counter, and a notification popped up. I glanced at it out of habit, expecting something mundane. Instead, it was a message from someone named Derek. The preview was short. "Can't wait for tomorrow." Smiley face. My stomach churned, but I quickly looked away. Could be innocent, I told myself. A fan, a friend. Nothing more. Still, a seed of doubt had been planted, and I couldn't ignore it. Over the next few days, I began to notice other things. Her phone was always with her, never left unattended. She'd started locking the screen, something she'd never done before. And there were moments, fleeting but sharp, when I'd catch her smiling at her screen in a way I hadn't seen her smile at me in months. The unease grew, gnawing at me in quiet moments. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who snooped, who let jealousy cloud his judgment. But the distance between us felt like a chasm, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was on the other side, pulling her away from me. The morning light filtered through the curtains as I stood in the kitchen, pouring a second cup of coffee. My phone buzzed on the counter, pulling my attention from the kids squabbling over breakfast. Jack was complaining about Lily's cereal choice, his voice tinged with the indignation only a 9-year-old could muster. "Mom, she's slurping," he whined. "Lily, chew quietly," I said absent-mindedly, picking up my phone. Another notification from Derek. I couldn't help the small smile that tugged at my lips. The message was simple. "Your new post is amazing. You have such an eye for detail." Derek had been one of my earliest and most enthusiastic followers. He often left thoughtful comments on my photos, and his messages quickly became a highlight of my day. At first, it was purely professional. He admired my work, and I appreciated his support. But over time, our conversations had grown more personal. He seemed to understand me in a way that even Ethan didn't anymore. I shook off the thought, tucking my phone into my pocket. Ethan was a good husband, and I didn't want to take him for granted. But lately, it felt like we were living parallel lives. He was so focused on work, on the construction firm that seemed to consume his every waking moment. And I was trying to find something for myself, something beyond being a mom and a wife. After dropping the kids at school, I drove to a nearby park with my camera in tow. Photography had always been a passion of mine, a way to capture beauty in the ordinary. It was how my blog had started, a simple outlet for my creative energy. But as my following grew, so did the pressure to keep producing. Every shot had to be perfect, every caption engaging. Derek's words often echoed in my mind during these sessions. "You see things others miss," he'd told me once. It was flattering, of course, but it was more than that. It made me feel seen, appreciated in a way I hadn't felt in years. As I reviewed the photos on my camera, I noticed a text from my friend, Jenna. She'd been my confidant since college, the one person I could tell anything. "Jenna, lunch today?" "Me sure. Noon at Bella's?" I packed up my things, already thinking about how to broach the subject that had been weighing on me. Jenna would understand. She always did. Bella's was bustling when I arrived, the aroma of fresh bread and espresso enveloping me as I walked in. Jenna was already seated near the window, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. She waved me over, her smile warm and familiar. "Hey, you look great," she said as I slid into the seat opposite her. "Thanks. You too." I hesitated, fiddling with the edge of my napkin. "Jenna, can I ask you something?" "Of course. What's up?" I took a deep breath. "Do you ever feel stuck? Like you're just going through the motions?" Her brow furrowed. "Sometimes, yeah. Why? Is everything okay?" "I don't know. It's just, Ethan and I, we're not connecting the way we used to. And then there's this guy." I trailed off, unsure how much to share. Jenna's eyes widened. "A guy? Sarah, what are you saying?" "It's not what you think," I said quickly. "He's just a friend. Someone I met through the blog. But he makes me feel seen." Jenna leaned back, her expression serious. "Sarah, be careful. It's easy to romanticize someone who only sees the best parts of you. But real relationships are messy. They take work." "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to fix what's broken between Ethan and me." That night, Ethan was unusually quiet at dinner. He asked the kids about their day, listened patiently as Lily described her art project and Jack recounted a playground soccer game. But his eyes kept flicking to me, his expression unreadable. After the kids went to bed, I found him in the living room, staring at the TV without really watching it. "Hey," I said, sitting down beside him. "You okay?" He nodded but didn't meet my eyes. "Yeah, just tired." The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things we weren't saying. I wanted to tell him about Derek, about how lost I felt, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I placed my hand on his, hoping the gesture would say what I couldn't. He squeezed my hand lightly, his gaze still fixed on the screen. "I miss us," he said softly, almost to himself. My chest tightened. "Me too," I whispered. We sat like that for a long time, the unspoken truths hanging between us like shadows. The days after my quiet admission to Sarah were a blur of routine and silence. I woke up, made breakfast for the kids, went to work, and returned home to more silence. Conversations with Sarah were reduced to short exchanges about the kids or household logistics. But there was a storm brewing inside me. Questions I couldn't silence, suspicions I couldn't shake. I told myself I was overthinking. Maybe I was projecting my own frustrations onto Sarah. Yet every time I saw her hunched over her phone or caught her slipping out of the room to take a call, the knot in my stomach tightened. It was a Tuesday evening when things came to a head. I'd come home later than usual, exhausted from a grueling day at the firm. The kids were already in bed, and Sarah was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. The TV was on, but she wasn't watching it. "Long day?" she asked without looking up. "Yeah," I replied, shrugging off my jacket. "Anything exciting happen today?" "Not really. Just the usual," she said, her tone light but detached. It was the same answer she'd given me a dozen times before, but this time I couldn't let it go. "Sarah," I began, sitting down beside her. "What's going on with us?" She finally looked up, her eyes wary. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're not connecting anymore. You're always distracted, always on your phone. You barely talk to me unless it's about the kids. I feel like I'm losing you." Her face softened, but there was a hesitation in her expression that made my heart sink. "Ethan, I've been under a lot of pressure lately. The blog, the kids, everything. It's not about you." "Then what is it about?" I pressed. She hesitated again, then shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe I'm just tired." The words felt hollow, but I didn't push further. I wanted to believe her, to cling to the hope that this was just a phase. But deep down, I knew there was more to the story. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention. I noticed the way her demeanor shifted when she was on her phone. The small smiles, the quick glances to see if I was watching. I noticed how she always kept her screen tilted away from me or how she'd lock it the moment I walked into the room. One night, as she showered, she left her phone on the nightstand. It was unlocked, the screen glowing with a new notification. My heart pounded as I leaned over to look. The message was from someone named Derek. "Can't wait for this weekend. Miss you." Smiley face. My stomach twisted. Who was Derek? What weekend? I stared at the message, torn between anger and disbelief. Part of me wanted to scroll further to find more answers, but the other part of me was terrified of what I might uncover. When Sarah came out of the shower, she immediately noticed the look on my face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her tone cautious. I hesitated, then shook my head. "Nothing. Just tired." She didn't press, and I didn't offer any more. But that night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to silence the questions swirling in my mind. The following day at work, I confided in my friend and colleague, Mark. He was one of the few people I trusted implicitly. "Hey, can I ask you something?" I said as we sat in the break room. "Sure. What's up?" I hesitated, then decided to just say it. "If you thought your wife was hiding something from you, how would you handle it?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "That's a loaded question. Are we talking little secrets or big ones?" "I don't know. Maybe both," I admitted. He studied me for a moment, then leaned forward. "Ethan, you've got to trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. But before you jump to conclusions, talk to her. Really talk to her. And if that doesn't work, well, you might need to dig a little deeper." I nodded, his words resonating more than I wanted to admit. The truth was, I didn't want to dig. I didn't want to confirm the fears that had been gnawing at me. But I also couldn't keep living in this limbo. That evening, as I tucked Lily and Jack into bed. I couldn't help but feel the weight of what I might be about to uncover. Lily smiled sleepily as I kissed her forehead. "Good night, Daddy," she murmured. "Good night, sweetheart," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Jack was already snoring softly, his favorite book still clutched in his hands. I lingered in their room longer than usual, soaking in their innocence and the simplicity of their world. Whatever was happening with Sarah, I knew one thing for certain. I would protect my kids at all costs. They were my anchor, the reason I couldn't let this unravel any further without answers. As I closed their door, I steeled myself for the conversation I'd been avoiding. It was time to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Ethan felt like a shadow in his own life, watching events unfold around him as if from a distance. Sarah's laughter, the clink of dishes during family dinner, even the kids' playful arguments. It all seemed to happen in another world, one he was no longer a part of. His confrontation with the messages had left him raw, but he hadn't said anything to Sarah yet. He needed more proof, more clarity, more understanding of how their lives had unraveled to this point. It was Saturday afternoon when Sarah left the house again, her excuse vague. "A meeting," she said. Ethan nodded, keeping his expression neutral, but inside, he was churning. "Be back by dinner," she added, kissing Lily and Jack on their foreheads before slipping out the door. The moment her car pulled out of the driveway, Ethan sprang into action. He dialed Mark, who picked up on the second ring. "You sure about this?" Mark asked, his voice cautious. "Positive," Ethan said, already grabbing his jacket. "I need to know." Mark sighed. "All right, where are we meeting?" They parked in an unassuming spot a block away from the cafe Sarah had mentioned once or twice when talking about blog meetings. Ethan's heart was pounding as he and Mark watched the entrance from inside Mark's truck. "She might not even show up here," Mark pointed out. "She will," Ethan said grimly. "Derek lives 2 towns over. If she's meeting him, it's going to be somewhere in the middle." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before Sarah appeared. She stepped out of her car, her phone clutched in her hand, and walked toward the cafe. Ethan held his breath, his eyes glued to her as the door swung open. Moments later, a man followed, tall, clean-shaven, dressed in casual but polished clothes. He greeted Sarah with an easy smile, and she beamed back at him in a way Ethan hadn't seen in years. "That him?" Mark asked. Ethan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The pair took a table by the window, their heads close together as they talked. Ethan couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told him everything he needed to know. The way Sarah leaned forward, her hand occasionally brushing Derek's arm. The way he smiled at her, his gaze lingering longer than was appropriate. Mark placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Ethan, let's go. You've seen enough." But Ethan didn't move. His mind was a storm of emotions. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak, and a gnawing sense of failure. How had it come to this? After a long moment, he nodded. "All right," he said hoarsely. "Let's go." The drive home was silent. Mark didn't push for conversation, sensing that Ethan needed space to process what he'd seen. When they pulled into Ethan's driveway, Mark finally spoke. "What are you going to do now?" Ethan stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can't let this continue. Not for me and not for the kids." Mark nodded. "Whatever you decide, I'm here. Just say the word." That evening, Sarah returned home as if nothing had happened. She kissed the kids goodnight, laughed at one of Jack's jokes, and helped Lily find her favorite stuffed animal before bed. Ethan watched her, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him like a lead blanket. When the house was quiet, he found her in the living room, scrolling through her phone as usual. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady but cold. She looked up, startled by his tone. "What is it?" Ethan stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Who is Derek?" Her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for an answer. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a strange sense of clarity. The time for avoidance and half-truths was over. Sarah's expression froze, her face drained of color. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights, her phone still clutched tightly in her hand. "Ethan," she said finally, her voice trembling, "it's not what you think." Ethan folded his arms across his chest, his jaw tightening. "Then tell me what it is, Sarah. Who is Derek? And don't lie to me. I've seen the messages." Her eyes widened, panic flickering across her face. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. "You've been meeting him, haven't you?" Ethan pressed, his voice rising. "All those blog meetings you've been going to, it was him, wasn't it?" Sarah's shoulders sagged as she looked down at the floor. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The word hit Ethan like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "How long, Sarah? How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, and Ethan could see the war raging in her mind. Finally, she spoke. "A few months. A few months," Ethan repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around, spending time with another man, while I've been here, taking care of our kids and trying to make this marriage work. I didn't mean for it to happen," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. It started out innocent. We were just talking. He understood me in a way that I don't." Ethan interrupted, his voice sharp. "You think I don't understand you, Sarah? You think I haven't tried to be there for you, to support you? It's not like that," she cried, her voice breaking. "You don't know what it's been like for me, Ethan. I felt so alone, so invisible." Ethan shook his head, his chest heaving. "So what? You decided the best way to fix that was to cheat on me? To betray everything we've built?" The argument continued late into the night, both of them hurling words they couldn't take back. Sarah tried to justify her actions, but every explanation only deepened the wound. Ethan's anger gave way to despair, and by the time the house fell silent, they were both emotionally drained. Sarah slept in the guest room that night. Ethan stayed up, pacing the living room, replaying the argument in his mind. He thought about their children, who were blissfully unaware of the turmoil unfolding around them. What would this mean for Lily and Jack? How could he protect them from the fallout? The next morning, Sarah found Ethan in the kitchen, staring into his coffee mug as if it held the answers he was searching for. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice hoarse from crying. Ethan didn't look up. "Sorry for what, Sarah? Sorry you got caught? Sorry you've been lying to me for months? Or sorry you destroyed our family?" She flinched but didn't respond. Ethan finally met her gaze, his eyes cold and hard. "I can't do this anymore. I want a divorce." The words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. "Ethan, please," Sarah whispered, tears welling up again. "We can work through this. For the kids, if nothing else." Ethan shook his head. "The kids deserve better than this. Better than us pretending everything's fine when it's not. I'll fight for joint custody, Sarah. But this marriage is over." Ethan spent the next few days reaching out to lawyers, researching the divorce process, and preparing for the difficult conversations that lay ahead. He knew it wouldn't be easy, especially with Lily and Jack, but he also knew it was the right decision. Sarah, meanwhile, withdrew into herself. She stopped mentioning Derek, and Ethan didn't ask. He didn't need to. The damage was done. Ethan sat at the edge of the bed, the morning sunlight streaming through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. His chest felt heavy as he rehearsed the words he would say to Lily and Jack. He had gone over it countless times in his head, but no amount of preparation could make this easier. "Are you sure you want to do it today?" Sarah's voice broke the silence. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes puffy from sleepless nights. Ethan nodded, his jaw set. "They deserve to know, Sarah. I don't want them to feel blindsided when this starts affecting their lives." Sarah bit her lip, her gaze dropping to the floor. She didn't argue, and Ethan didn't wait for her to. He pushed himself up and headed toward the living room, where the kids were engrossed in cartoons. "Hey guys," Ethan said, forcing a smile as he sat down on the couch. Sarah followed quietly, taking a seat in the armchair nearby. Jack looked up first, his brow furrowing. "What's up, Dad? You look serious." Ethan exhaled slowly. "There's something your mom and I need to talk to you about. It's important." Lily turned her wide, curious eyes to him. "What is it?" Ethan glanced at Sarah, who gave him a small nod. He took a deep breath. "Your mom and we've decided to separate. It means we won't be living together as a family anymore." The room fell silent. The colorful animation on the TV flickered unnoticed. "What do you mean?" Jack asked, his voice trembling. "Why?" Ethan swallowed hard. "Sometimes, grown-ups have problems that they can't fix, no matter how hard they try. We love you both so much, and that will never change. But your mom and I think this is the best choice for everyone." Lily's lip quivered. "Are we not a family anymore?" Ethan's heart broke at her words. He reached out, pulling her into his arms. "We'll always be a family, sweetheart. Just a little different. You'll still see both of us. We're going to share time with you, and you'll always have a home with each of us." The conversation stretched on, filled with tears and questions Ethan didn't always have answers for. Jack alternated between anger and sadness, while Lily clung to Ethan as if he might disappear if she let go. "Is it our fault?" Jack asked suddenly, his voice cracking. "No, Jack. Never," Sarah interjected, her voice firm. "This has nothing to do with you or Lily. You're the best thing in our lives, and that will never change." Jack nodded, though his expression remained doubtful. Lily stayed quiet, her head buried in Ethan's chest. That night, after the kids were asleep, Ethan and Sarah sat together in the kitchen. It was the first time in weeks they had shared a moment that didn't feel like a confrontation. "They took it as well as we could have hoped," Sarah said, her voice weary. Ethan nodded, staring into his cup of tea. "It's still going to be hard on them." "I know," Sarah murmured. She hesitated before adding, "I don't want them to hate me, Ethan, for any of this." Ethan looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "They don't hate you, Sarah, but they'll need time to understand." Sarah nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. "And what about you? Do you hate me?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken feelings. Ethan took a long sip of his tea before answering. "I don't hate you, but I don't know if I'll ever forgive you." The days that followed were a whirlwind of paperwork and logistics. Ethan and Sarah worked with a mediator to outline custody arrangements. They agreed on alternating weeks, ensuring the kids would have as much stability as possible. Ethan threw himself into the details, determined to create a safe and loving environment for Jack and Lily in his home. Meanwhile, Sarah's presence grew quieter. She avoided Derek's messages, though they still lit up her phone at odd hours. Her relationship with him, once intoxicating, now felt like a hollow echo of the life she had just shattered. Ethan's new routine took shape quickly. His mornings began earlier than ever, ensuring Lily and Jack were ready for school. He packed their lunches, double-checked homework, and made sure their shoes matched, something Sarah used to do with ease. Weekdays were a blur of work at the construction firm and evenings filled with homework, soccer practices, and bedtime stories. The house felt emptier during the weeks the kids stayed with Sarah. Ethan found himself standing in their rooms more often than he cared to admit, straightening already neat toys or picking up books that hadn't been touched. The silence was deafening, and he filled it by pouring himself into his work, staying late at the office to avoid going home. On the other side of town, Sarah was navigating her own struggles. The initial thrill of independence she thought she'd feel was overshadowed by a sense of loss. She missed the small moments, Lily's drawings on the fridge, Jack's endless questions about dinosaurs. Her blog, once her escape, now felt like a burden. Even Derek had started to feel more like a reminder of what she'd lost than a source of joy. "Why do you seem distracted all the time?" Derek asked one afternoon as they sat at a cafe. There's a lot going on," Sarah said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. He leaned closer, his brow furrowed. "You don't seem happy. Isn't this what you wanted?" The question lingered in her mind long after Derek left. Was it what she wanted? She wasn't sure anymore. One Friday evening, Ethan picked up the kids from Sarah's house for his week with them. Lily ran to him, clutching a stuffed animal tightly. "Daddy, I missed you," she said, wrapping her arms around his legs. "I missed you too, sweetheart," Ethan replied, lifting her into his arms. Jack followed, his bag slung over his shoulder and a smile tugging at his lips. "How's soccer practice going?" Ethan asked as they walked to the car. "Great. I scored a goal last week," Jack said, his voice filled with pride. "That's my boy." Ethan ruffled Jack's hair, feeling a rare moment of contentment. As they drove home, Lily chattered about her week at school, while Jack hummed along to the radio. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a sense of normalcy, however fleeting. That weekend, Ethan took the kids to the park. Jack raced off to the soccer field to join a group of kids, while Lily stayed close, holding Ethan's hand. "Daddy, are you sad?" Lily asked suddenly, her wide eyes searching his face. Ethan knelt down to her level, his heart aching at her perceptiveness. "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" "Because you look sad sometimes," she said softly. Ethan pulled her into a hug. "I'm okay, Lily. Promise. Things are just a little different now, but we're going to be okay." She nodded against his shoulder, and Ethan held her close, wishing he could protect her from the weight of everything that had changed. Meanwhile, Sarah spent her weekend alone, the absence of the kids a sharp reminder of the life she used to have. She found herself scrolling through old photos on her phone, family trips to the beach, Jack's birthday parties, Lily's first day of school. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was a message from Derek. "Let's meet tonight. I miss you." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment before typing a reply. "I don't think that's a good idea." Derek responded almost immediately. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" "I need some time," Sarah wrote, her fingers trembling. She set the phone down, a strange mix of relief and sadness washing over her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she needed to figure out who she was, alone. That Sunday evening, as Ethan tucked the kids into bed, Jack looked up at him. "Are you happy, Dad?" Jack asked, his voice quiet. Ethan paused, surprised by the question. "Why do you ask, buddy?" Jack shrugged. "I just want to make sure you're okay." Ethan smiled, ruffling Jack's hair. "I'm okay. And as long as you and Lily are happy, I'm happy too." Jack nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. As Ethan closed the door, he felt a pang of longing for the simplicity of the life they used to have. But he also felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that, even in the midst of loss, there was still room to rebuild. The months passed slowly, marked by the rhythm of shared custody and the awkward dance of co-parenting. Ethan and Sarah's interactions were brief and transactional, revolving around the children's schedules and school events. Though civil on the surface, there was an unspoken tension that lingered like a shadow. Ethan had thrown himself into work and fatherhood, striving to create a stable home for Lily and Jack. The house felt less empty now, filled with their laughter and the chaos of toys scattered across the floor. But even as he focused on his children, there were moments of loneliness he couldn't ignore. One evening, Ethan attended a parent-teacher conference at Jack and Lily's school. The teachers were polite and complimentary, praising Jack's enthusiasm and Lily's creativity. As the meetings wrapped up, Ethan spotted Sarah in the hallway, talking to another parent. It was the first time in weeks he'd seen her outside the brief exchanges during pickups and drop-offs. She looked tired, her shoulders slightly slumped, but she smiled politely at the other parent before turning and catching Ethan's gaze. "Hi," she said, her voice tentative. "Hi," Ethan replied, his tone neutral. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the noise of other parents filling the space between them. "The kids are doing well," Sarah said finally, breaking the silence. "They are," Ethan agreed. "You've done a good job with them." Sarah looked surprised at the compliment. "Thank you. You have too." Another pause. Ethan searched for something to say but came up empty. Sarah opened her mouth as if to speak, then hesitated and shook her head. "Good night, Ethan," she said softly, turning to leave. "Good night," he replied, watching her walk away. Sarah drove home in silence, her mind replaying the brief interaction. It was strange, seeing Ethan like that, distant but composed, a stranger in the life they used to share. She thought about what she might have said, the apologies she still carried but hadn't voiced. When she arrived home, she found herself scrolling through photos again. One caught her eye. A candid shot of Ethan holding Lily when she was just a baby, his face alight with joy. Sarah stared at the photo for a long time, a lump forming in her throat. She had made choices she couldn't undo, and now she was left to grapple with the aftermath. Derek's texts had grown less frequent, and Sarah had stopped responding altogether. Whatever spark had existed between them had faded, leaving only the ashes of regret. Ethan, too, found himself reflecting on the past. Late one night, after the kids were asleep, he pulled out an old photo album. The images told the story of their family, the birthdays, vacations, and quiet moments that had once defined their life together. He stopped at a photo of him and Sarah on their wedding day, both of them smiling as if nothing could ever touch them. Ethan traced the edge of the photo with his finger, his chest tight with a mix of longing and anger. The next morning, Mark stopped by the office. Ethan welcomed the distraction, grateful for his friend's steady presence. "How's everything going?" Mark asked, leaning against the desk. "All right, I guess," Ethan replied, though the weariness in his voice betrayed him. Mark studied him for a moment. "You ever think about dating again?" Ethan looked up sharply. "Dating? Yeah," Mark said, shrugging. "It's been a while. You deserve to find some happiness, Ethan." Ethan shook his head. "I'm not ready for that. The kids come first." "They always will," Mark said gently. "But that doesn't mean you have to put your life on hold forever." Ethan didn't respond, though the thought lingered long after Mark left. Sarah, meanwhile, had begun to rebuild her blog, channeling her emotions into her photography. Her posts took on a new tone, less polished, more honest. She wrote about loss, resilience, and the complexities of starting over. The response was overwhelming. Her followers praised her vulnerability, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt a sense of purpose that didn't rely on external validation. But purpose didn't erase the ache of what she'd lost. One evening, as Sarah was cleaning out a closet, she found a box of letters and mementos from her and Ethan's early years together. She sifted through the contents, her fingers lingering on an old anniversary card from Ethan. "No matter what life throws at us, we'll always find our way back to each other." Sarah closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She didn't know if that was still true, but the memory of what they'd once had was enough to keep her heart heavy. Autumn arrived with a chill in the air and a vibrant canopy of red and gold leaves. The change in seasons mirrored the shifts in Ethan and Sarah's lives, subtle yet undeniable. They were moving forward, though not without stumbling over the pieces of their broken past. For Ethan, the focus remained on his children. He was learning to navigate life as a single father, leaning into his new normal. The loneliness that had once consumed him had dulled, replaced by a steady rhythm of work, school events, and weekend adventures with Lily and Jack. One Saturday, Ethan decided to take the kids apple picking at a local farm. It was a tradition he and Sarah had started when Jack was a toddler, and though it felt strange to do it without her, Ethan pushed the thought aside. Jack darted between the trees, climbing to the highest branches to find the biggest apples, while Lily stayed close to Ethan, giggling as she tried to reach the lower branches. "Look, Daddy." Lily held up a small, misshapen apple, her face beaming. "Perfect," Ethan said, ruffling her hair. "That one's going right at the top of the pile." As they filled their basket, Ethan's mind wandered back to the last time they'd come as a family. He could still hear Sarah's laughter, see her holding Lily on her hip while Jack raced around her feet. The memory was bittersweet, a reminder of what had been and what could never be again. Sarah spent her weekend in quiet reflection. The kids were with Ethan, and the house felt achingly still. She filled the hours with photography, capturing the beauty of the season, but her thoughts often strayed to her family. That evening, she sat on the back porch, a cup of tea warming her hands. She had spent months trying to reconcile the choices she'd made, grappling with the guilt and the longing for a life she'd let slip away. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. It was Jenna, her old college friend. Jenna, hey, thinking of you. How are you holding up? Sarah hesitated before typing a reply. Sarah, I'm okay. Just taking it one day at a time. Jenna, if you ever need to talk, I'm here. Let's grab coffee soon. Sarah, I'd like that. Thanks, Jenna. The conversation was brief but comforting. Sarah set the phone down and stared out at the fading light, the ache in her chest growing heavier. The next week, Ethan and Sarah attended a parent-teacher conference together. The school had asked both parents to meet with Jack's teacher to discuss his progress. They arrived separately but greeted each other with polite nods. As they sat side by side in the small classroom, listening to the teacher praise Jack's enthusiasm and creativity, Ethan couldn't help but notice how tired Sarah looked. After the meeting, they walked out to the parking lot together. Jack's doing great, Ethan said, breaking the silence. Sarah nodded. He is. I'm proud of him. Ethan glanced at her. How are you doing, Sarah? She hesitated, caught off guard by the question. I'm managing. It's been a lot to adjust to. Ethan nodded, his expression softening. If you ever need help with the kids, just say so. I mean it. Thank you, Sarah said, her voice quiet. For a moment, they stood in the crisp evening air, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. There were no apologies, no attempts to bridge the chasm that had grown between them. But there was an understanding, a fragile truce born of their mutual love for their children. That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The conversation with Sarah replayed in his mind, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something other than anger or sadness. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close to peace. Sarah, too, found herself reflecting on the evening. She thought about the look in Ethan's eyes when he'd asked how she was doing. A look that reminded her of the man she'd fallen in love with all those years ago. She knew she couldn't undo the damage she'd caused. But maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to coexist, not as a couple, but as two people working toward a common goal, giving their children the love and stability they deserved. The first snow of the season had blanketed the town, turning the world into a quiet, shimmering landscape. Ethan stood at the window watching Lily and Jack play in the yard. They had begged him to let them build a snowman before dinner, and their laughter now filled the crisp winter air. Behind him, the kitchen was warm and bustling with the smell of stew simmering on the stove. The scene felt almost idyllic, but Ethan couldn't ignore the ache that came with knowing it wasn't complete. Across town, Sarah was wrapping presents at the dining room table. The kids would be spending Christmas morning with her this year, and she wanted it to be perfect. The house was decorated, the tree glowing softly in the corner, but the silence felt heavier than ever. She stared at a framed photo of the four of them on the mantel, taken years ago during a family vacation. It was a moment frozen in time, a reminder of what she had given up. That weekend, Ethan and Sarah met at a local cafe to finalize holiday plans. It was neutral ground, chosen to avoid disrupting the fragile truce they had managed to maintain. I'll bring them to your house by noon on Christmas Eve, Ethan said, stirring his coffee. That way, they'll have the evening and morning with you. Sarah nodded, her hands wrapped around her mug. Thank you. I'll make sure they're ready when it's time for them to come back to you. Ethan studied her for a moment. She looked better than she had in months. Less worn, more composed. Still, there was a sadness in her eyes that mirrored his own. How are you holding up? He asked, surprising even himself. Sarah gave him a small, sad smile. Some days are better than others. I miss them when they're not with me. Me too, Ethan admitted. But they seem happy. That's what matters. They fell into a brief silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Ethan, Sarah said hesitantly, I want you to know how sorry I am for everything. He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I know, Sarah. I've known for a while now. Do you think you'll ever forgive me? She asked, her voice barely audible. Ethan sighed, his gaze distant. I don't know if I can forgive everything, but I can move forward. For the kids, and for myself. Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She nodded, accepting his words as the closest thing to forgiveness she would ever receive. The holiday season brought a flurry of activity. Ethan and Sarah each created new traditions with Lily and Jack, working hard to ensure their children felt loved and secure despite the changes in their family. On Christmas morning, Ethan received a surprise text from Sarah. It was a photo of the kids, both of them beaming as they opened their gifts under her tree. Sarah, Merry Christmas, Ethan. Thank you for everything. Ethan stared at the message for a long moment before typing a reply. Ethan, Merry Christmas, Sarah. Take care of them. As the months turned into years, Ethan and Sarah settled into their new lives. The wounds of the past didn't disappear, but they softened with time. They became partners in parenting, if not in life, learning to support each other in ways they hadn't during their marriage. For Ethan, there were new beginnings. He eventually found himself drawn to someone new. A quiet, kind-hearted woman who shared his love for the simple joys in life. For Sarah, there was self-discovery. She poured herself into her photography, using it as a way to process her regrets and celebrate her growth. Lily and Jack thrived, their laughter and resilience a testament to the love that surrounded them, even in a fractured family. On a spring afternoon, years after their separation, Ethan and Sarah found themselves standing side by side at Jack's soccer game. The kids were older now, more independent, but they still looked to their parents with the same hopeful eyes. As Jack scored the winning goal and Lily cheered wildly from the sidelines, Ethan and Sarah exchanged a glance. We did all right, Sarah said softly, a hint of pride in her voice. Ethan smiled faintly. Yeah, we did. For the first time, the past didn't feel like a weight holding them down. It felt like a foundation, flawed but strong enough to build a future on. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.